Royal Rife's frequency instrument. In 1934, in a small clinical laboratory in San Diego, California, 16 terminal cancer patients sat inside a room humming with invisible energy. Their doctors had given them up. The hospitals had sent them home. But a quiet, methodical inventor named Royal Raymond Rife had built something that the medical establishment had never seen. A device that targeted cancer cells using precise resonant frequencies, the same way an opera singer shatters a wine glass with a single sustained note. Within 90 days, 14 of the 16 patients were declared clinically cured. The remaining 2 followed within the next 6 weeks. The cure rate was 100%. Rife had spent over a decade building toward that moment. His universal microscope, completed in 1933, was a marvel that no institution has fully replicated to this day. A device capable of magnifying living specimens at 60,000 times their size without killing the cells, something that standard optical microscopes fundamentally cannot do. Through it, Rife could observe living microorganisms in real time, watching them respond, mutate, and, crucially, die when exposed to specific frequencies. He called these frequencies mortal oscillatory rates. Every pathogen, he believed, had one. Find the right frequency, apply it long enough, and the organism would vibrate itself apart while surrounding healthy tissue remained completely unharmed. The 1934 clinical trial was not conducted in secret. It was overseen by a special medical research committee from the University of Southern California. The physicians involved were not fringe practitioners. They included Dr. Milbank Johnson, one of the most respected medical figures in Los Angeles. The results were documented, witnessed, and submitted. What happened next was not a peer review. What happened next was silence. The committee's records were never formally published. Johnson himself died suddenly in 1944, just hours before he was scheduled to hold a press conference announcing Rife's results to the public. His personal papers were immediately seized. By the late 1930s, a man named Morris Fishbein, the head of the American Medical Association, had reportedly approached Rife with an offer to buy into his technology. Rife refused. Within months, the laboratories of his key collaborator, Dr. Arthur Kendall, were raided. Equipment was confiscated. Rife's own lab was broken into, and years of irreplaceable microscope slides were destroyed. Colleagues who had witnessed the 1934 trials found their medical licenses threatened. One by one, the people who had seen the machine work went quiet. Rife himself never recovered. He descended into alcoholism through the 1940s and 1950s, watching his life's work be dismantled piece by piece. The microscope he had spent years perfecting disappeared from the Burnett laboratory under circumstances that were never explained. No investigation was pursued. The man who had reportedly achieved a 100% cure rate for terminal cancer patients died in 1971 in relative obscurity, his name absent from every mainstream medical textbook, every oncology journal, every official history of cancer research. To this day, the original Rife frequency instrument has never been formally tested by any government health agency. The University of Southern California's 1934 clinical records have never been officially released. Independent researchers who have attempted to reconstruct Rife's microscope report being unable to locate the original lens specifications, which vanished along with everything else. If Rife's device truly worked, if terminal cancer patients were genuinely cured using nothing more than targeted sound frequencies, then the implications for the pharmaceutical industry would have been catastrophic. And if that is what it threatened, then someone had every reason to make sure Royal Rife was never remembered at all. Lakhovsky's multi-wave oscillator. In 1925, in a laboratory on the outskirts of Paris, a Russian-born engineer named Georges Lakhovsky made a claim that should have rewritten the history of medicine. He proposed that every living cell in the human body functioned like a tiny radio transmitter and receiver, constantly broadcasting and receiving electromagnetic frequencies, and that cancer was nothing more than a cell that had lost its ability to oscillate at the correct frequency. The solution, he argued, was not to poison the body with chemicals or burn it with radiation. The solution was to restore the signal. And he built a machine to do exactly that. The device Lakhovsky called the multi-wave oscillator generated a broad spectrum of electromagnetic frequencies simultaneously, theoretically allowing diseased cells to select and absorb the precise frequency they needed to return to healthy function. It was not a subtle instrument. It filled a room with crackling energy and produced effects that observers described as immediate and visceral. Patients reportedly felt warmth moving through their bodies during sessions. Tumors, according to documented clinical observations from hospitals in France and Italy, began to shrink. By the late 1920s, the device was being used in prestigious medical institutions across Europe, including the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, one of the oldest and most respected medical centers in the world. Lakhovsky was not a hidden figure. He published extensively, corresponded with scientists across Europe and the United States, and his work attracted serious academic attention. His 1925 book, The Secret of Life, was translated into multiple languages and read by researchers on both sides of the Atlantic. He relocated to New York in 1941, reportedly at the invitation of American physicians who wanted to test his device in U.S. hospitals. Clinical trials at Bellevue Hospital and the New York Skin and Cancer Hospital were reportedly conducted with encouraging results. Then, in 1942, Lakhovsky was struck by a car in New York City. He died from his injuries shortly after. He was 73 years old. No formal investigation into his death was ever conducted. His laboratory equipment was quietly dispersed. The hospital trial records were never published. The physicians who had worked alongside him reportedly faced institutional pressure to distance themselves from his research, and within a decade the multi-wave oscillator had been erased from mainstream medical literature as completely as if it had never existed. The technology did not evolve, was not disproven through rigorous study, and was not replaced by something better. It simply vanished. What makes Lakhovsky's case particularly difficult to dismiss is the institutional weight behind his work. These were not fringe clinics operating outside the medical establishment. These were premier European hospitals with established research departments and credentialed physicians documenting patient outcomes. To this day, no regulatory agency has published a comprehensive review of the Salpêtrière clinical records. No government body has formally explained why a device used in major hospitals across 2 continents disappeared from medicine entirely within a single decade. If Lakhovsky's multi-wave oscillator truly restored cellular oscillation in cancer patients, if the documented hospital cases represent genuine remissions driven by electromagnetic frequency restoration, then the entire pharmaceutical model of cancer treatment becomes not just unnecessary but arguably obsolete. And if that is what his machine threatened, then the timing of his death, the disappearance of his records, and the institutional silence that followed begin to look like something far more deliberate than coincidence. If you're finding these patterns interesting, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Every week we explore suppressed technologies that mainstream media ignores. Click the bell icon so you don't miss a single episode. The stories we cover are the ones that never make it into the headlines, and that is exactly why they matter. The Hoxsey Electrochemical device. In 1924, in Taylorville, Illinois, a former coal miner named Harry Hoxsey opened a cancer clinic that would become the largest private cancer treatment network in the United States, and the most aggressively persecuted medical operation in American history. Hoxsey was not a trained physician. What he had was a formula, passed down through 4 generations of his family, originally developed by his great-great-grandfather after observing a horse with a leg tumor heal itself by grazing on specific wild plants. Combined with an electrochemical device that delivered low-level electrical currents directly to tumor sites, Hoxsey's treatment reportedly produced results that drew terminal patients from across the country. By the 1950s, Hoxsey operated 17 clinics across the United States. His flagship Dallas clinic was the largest cancer treatment center in the world at the time, treating an estimated 10,000 patients annually. Patients who had been told by conventional doctors that nothing more could be done were arriving at Hoxsey's doors and, according to documented testimonials and independent physician reviews, leaving with their tumors gone. In 1954, a committee of 10 independent physicians examined Hoxsey's patient records and publicly stated that his treatment was, in their assessment, producing verifiable cancer cures. The American Medical Association responded not with curiosity, but with a campaign. Morris Fishbein, the same AMA chief who had reportedly approached Royal Rife a decade earlier, declared Hoxsey a fraud and launched a 25-year war of attrition against him. The FDA raided his clinics repeatedly, confiscating electrochemical equipment and herbal preparations. Hoxsey was arrested more times than almost any other figure in American medical history, over 100 times by some accounts, though charges rarely resulted in conviction because patients kept showing up in court to testify that he had saved their lives. The legal costs, however, were relentless. The institutional pressure was suffocating. What do you think about what you're hearing? Share your theory in the comments below. And if you're finding this video informative, make sure to hit the like button. It signals the algorithm to push this content to more people who deserve to hear these stories. In 1963, facing insurmountable legal pressure in the United States, Hoxsey's head nurse, Mildred Nelson, relocated the clinic to Tijuana, Mexico, where it still operates to this day as the Biomedical Center. Hoxsey himself never practiced medicine again after the U.S. government's campaign effectively ended his ability to operate legally on American soil. He was diagnosed with prostate cancer in the 1960s and reportedly treated himself successfully using his own formula. He died in 1974, not from cancer, but from complications following surgery for an unrelated condition. No official government body ever conducted a rigorous, independently verified clinical trial of the Hoxsey treatment or his electrochemical device. The patient records from his Dallas clinic, which contained thousands of documented cases, were never formally reviewed by any federal health agency. To this day, the herbs at the core of his formula, including red clover, barberry root, and burdock, are the subjects of active pharmaceutical research for their anti-tumor properties. The industry that destroyed Harry Hoxsey is now quietly studying the plants he used. If the Hoxsey electrochemical device truly accelerated tumor destruction by delivering targeted electrical currents to cancer sites, and if the herbal formulas genuinely produced the remissions that 10 independent physicians documented, then what was eliminated in those raids was not a fraud. It was a working cancer treatment. And if that is what the American Medical Association understood it to be, then the 25-year campaign to destroy Harry Hoxsey was not consumer protection. It was something else entirely. Wilhelm Reich's Orgone Accumulator. In 1940, in a converted farmhouse in Rangeley, Maine, a man who had once been one of Sigmund Freud's most brilliant students was building wooden boxes lined with alternating layers of organic and metallic materials, and claiming they could concentrate an invisible life force energy he called Orgone. Wilhelm Reich was not a charlatan operating from the fringes of science. He held a medical degree from the University of Vienna, had published peer-reviewed psychiatric research, and had been a practicing clinician for over 2 decades. But by the time he arrived in America, fleeing Nazi persecution in Europe, his theories had moved far beyond psychiatry, and what he was now claiming about cancer would bring the full force of the United States government down upon him. Reich believed that orgone energy, a primordial biological energy present in all living matter, could be accumulated and directed into the human body using his specially constructed boxes, which he called orgone energy accumulators. Cancer, in his framework, was the result of chronic orgone depletion in the body's tissues, a biological shrinking he termed biopathy. Patients who sat inside his accumulators, he reported, experienced measurable increases in body temperature, improved energy levels, and in documented cases, the regression of tumor masses. He was not alone in observing these effects. Several physicians who visited his Orgone research facility in Maine reportedly confirmed the biological readings he recorded. Reich's research attracted a following that cut across disciplines: scientists, physicians, and intellectuals who found his framework provocative and his clinical observations difficult to dismiss outright. But it also attracted the attention of a young FDA inspector who, in 1947, filed a report characterizing Reich's work as dangerous pseudoscience. The FDA opened a formal investigation. What followed was not a scientific rebuttal. What do you think about this story? Share your theory in the comments. And if you're finding this video informative, make sure to hit the like button. It signals the algorithm to push this content to more people who deserve to know what has been hidden from them. In 1954, the FDA obtained a federal injunction ordering Reich to stop distributing his accumulators and to destroy all related materials. Reich refused, arguing that a federal court had no jurisdiction over scientific research and natural phenomena. He continued his work. In 1956, FDA agents arrived at Orgone with a court order. They oversaw the physical destruction of his accumulators, smashed with axes, and the burning of his published books and research journals. It was one of the only government-sanctioned book burnings in American history. Reich was arrested for contempt of court and sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. He never left. Wilhelm Reich died in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary on November 3, 1957, just 3 weeks before he was eligible for a parole hearing. The official cause of death was heart failure. He was 60 years old and had reportedly been in good health when he entered the facility. No independent autopsy was conducted. His remaining research materials were seized by the FDA and held under court order, some of them sealed and classified until 2007, 50 years after his death. To this day, the full contents of the FDA's investigative file on Wilhelm Reich have never been made public. If Reich's Orgone accumulator truly concentrated a measurable biological energy capable of reversing tumor growth, then what was burned in those fires in 1956 was not dangerous literature. It was evidence. And if that is what the FDA understood it to be, then what happened in that main facility was not law enforcement. It was erasure. Gaston Naessens' Somatoscope. In 1949, in a small laboratory in Corsica, France, a young biologist named Gaston Naessens completed construction of a microscope unlike anything the scientific world had officially sanctioned. He called it the Somatoscope. Using a combination of UV light, magnetic fields, and a proprietary optical system he had developed independently, it achieved a magnification of 30,000 times with a resolution that allowed him to observe living blood in real time, without staining, without killing the specimen, without freezing the biological processes that standard laboratory preparation destroys. What he saw inside that living blood would consume the next 4 decades of his life and nearly cost him everything. Naessens observed tiny, subcellular particles moving through the blood plasma, particles that no standard microscope could detect and that no existing biological framework had described. He called them somatids. They were, he believed, the most fundamental units of life, indestructible carriers of genetic information that existed in a complex life cycle of 16 stages. In healthy individuals, somatids cycled through only the first 3 stages. In people with degenerative diseases, and particularly in cancer patients, the cycle continued far beyond those 3 stages, producing increasingly abnormal forms that Naessens believed directly correlated with the progression of disease. If you could read the somatid cycle, he argued, you could detect cancer years before any conventional test would find it. He developed a treatment based on this framework, a compound he called 714X, delivered by injection directly into the lymphatic system. It was designed to restore normal somatid cycling and reactivate the immune system's ability to destroy cancer cells. Patients who came to him, many of them terminal, many of them having exhausted conventional options, reportedly experienced dramatic recoveries. Word spread. Physicians in Canada, where Naessens had relocated by the 1960s, began referring patients to him quietly, unofficially, because the results they were seeing were impossible to explain through standard oncology. The medical establishment's response was not investigation. In 1989, Canadian health authorities charged Naessens with criminal negligence causing death, following the death of a cancer patient who had been treated with 714X. The case went to trial in Quebec. What emerged during those proceedings was striking. Over 40 of Naessens' former patients appeared in court to testify on his behalf, many of them presenting their own medical records showing terminal diagnoses that had been reversed. The jury acquitted him on all counts. No investigation was pursued into why the prosecution had been launched in the first place. The somatoscope itself was never independently evaluated by any government health agency. Naessens repeatedly offered to demonstrate his microscope and his somatid findings to scientific committees, and repeatedly found that formal institutions declined to engage. The National Cancer Institute in the United States reportedly received documentation of his work and chose not to respond. To this day, 714X remains illegal in the United States and is classified by Health Canada as an unauthorized drug, despite the fact that no controlled clinical trial has ever been conducted to formally test its efficacy or safety in cancer patients. Gaston Naessens died in 2018 at the age of 92, still working, still treating patients through channels that operated at the edge of what regulatory frameworks permitted. His somatoscope remains in private hands, its technology unverified and unrefuted by any official scientific body. If Naessens truly developed a microscope capable of detecting cancer years before conventional diagnostics, and if 714X genuinely restored immune function in terminal patients, then what was suppressed through those criminal proceedings was not dangerous quackery. It was early detection and a cure. And if that is what it represented, then someone had every reason to ensure Gaston Naessens spent his life fighting courtrooms instead of cancer. The Rife-Bare Device. In 1994, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a medical doctor named James Bare did something that the establishment had spent 60 years hoping no one would attempt. He rebuilt Royal Rife's frequency instrument. Working from fragments of Rife's original technical documentation, scattered papers, and the reconstructed accounts of researchers who had devoted years to recovering what had been deliberately erased, Bare constructed a plasma tube device that generated the same category of resonant frequencies Rife had used in his 1934 San Diego trials. He then did something Rife never had the opportunity to do. He published his schematics openly, made them freely available to researchers worldwide, and invited independent replication. The results that came back were not insignificant. Researchers and physicians working with Rife-Bare devices reported observable effects on cancer cell cultures in laboratory settings. Cells exposed to specific frequencies showed signs of structural disruption and death, while surrounding healthy cells remained intact. Patients using the devices under physician supervision reported tumor regression, pain reduction, and in several documented cases, outcomes that their oncologists could not account for through the conventional treatments running in parallel. A small but growing body of independent research was accumulating, carefully documented, carefully shared among a network of practitioners who understood exactly what they were dealing with and exactly how dangerous that knowledge was to hold. Bare himself was meticulous about how he framed his work. He made no public claims of cancer cures. He positioned the Rife-Bare device as a research instrument, not a medical treatment, specifically to avoid giving regulatory agencies the legal foothold they needed to act. It was a careful strategy, and for a time it worked. But by the late 1990s, the FDA had begun monitoring the growing network of Rife-Bare practitioners. Devices were seized during raids on alternative health practitioners across multiple states. Physicians who had been documenting patient outcomes with the device were visited by federal agents and warned. This isn't just one story, it's a pattern. If you're seeing the same pattern too, share this video. Tell your friends that certain technologies have been deliberately hidden from the people who need them most. Spreading this knowledge is what keeps the truth alive and makes sure these stories are never forgotten. The suppression took a different form than it had in Rife's era. There were no book burnings, no dramatic laboratory raids with axes. Instead, it came through the mechanism of the modern regulatory state: cease and desist letters, manufacturing violations, claims of unlicensed medical device distribution. The paperwork was different. The effect was identical. Practitioners who had been producing documented results found themselves buried under legal costs, their equipment confiscated, their patient records subpoenaed. The research network that Bare had spent years building was methodically dismantled, one practitioner at a time. James Bare continued to publish and advocate for frequency research until health limitations curtailed his ability to do so publicly. The open-source schematics he released remain available to this day, reproduced across dozens of independent research communities that operate largely outside the reach of mainstream institutional medicine. To this day, no controlled clinical trial funded by a major cancer research institution has ever formally tested a Rife-type frequency device on human cancer patients. Not one. The technology has existed in reconstructed form for over 30 years, and the silence from the institutions that claim to be searching for a cancer cure has been absolute. If the Rife-Bare device truly replicated the frequency-based tumor destruction that Royal Rife first documented in 1934, if the laboratory results and patient outcomes that practitioners recorded represent genuine, reproducible cancer remissions, then the 30 years of institutional silence is not an oversight. It is a policy, and if that is what it represents, then the system is not failing to find a cure. It is actively refusing to look at one. Robert O. Becker's electrotherapy system. In 1961, in a veterans hospital laboratory in Syracuse, New York, an orthopedic surgeon named Robert O. Becker made a discovery that should have launched a new era of medicine. Working with salamanders, creatures capable of regrowing entire limbs, Becker mapped the precise electrical currents that flowed through their bodies during the regeneration process and found something extraordinary. The electrical signals were not random biological noise. They were structured, directional, and measurable, a kind of biological direct current system that appeared to govern not just healing, but cellular identity itself. Becker wondered what would happen if you introduced those same currents into human tissue. What he found over the next 2 decades would make him one of the most important and most systematically marginalized scientists in American medical history. Becker's electrotherapy research produced results that conventional medicine had no framework to accommodate. He demonstrated that weak electrical currents applied to bone fractures accelerated healing at rates that defied standard biological timelines. He showed that silver ions activated by electrical current produced a powerful antimicrobial effect, killing bacteria that had proven resistant to every available antibiotic. And most provocatively, he documented evidence that the same electrical systems governing regeneration appeared to actively suppress tumor growth, that cancer cells, when exposed to specific low-level currents, dedifferentiated, reverting toward a more primitive cellular state that the immune system could then recognize and destroy. His findings were published in peer-reviewed journals. They were not ignored because they lacked rigor. They were ignored because of what they implied. By the late 1970s, Becker had become one of the leading voices warning about the biological dangers of electromagnetic pollution, the non-ionizing radiation produced by power lines, radar installations, and military communication systems. This put him in direct conflict not just with the medical establishment, but with the United States Department of Defense, which operated some of the most powerful electromagnetic transmission systems on the planet. His research suggested that the same frequencies the military was broadcasting across the country were measurably disrupting the biological electrical systems he had spent 20 years studying. He reportedly told colleagues that he had made powerful enemies he had not anticipated making. The consequences were swift and institutional. His research funding from the Veterans Administration was cut, then cut again. Applications for federal grants were denied without detailed explanation. Colleagues who collaborated with him found their own funding quietly threatened. His laboratory at the Syracuse VA Medical Center, the facility where he had conducted 2 decades of groundbreaking research, was closed in 1980. No formal scientific reason was ever provided. No investigation was pursued into the circumstances of its closure. Becker himself described the process in his 1985 book, The Body Electric, with a clarity that left little room for alternative interpretation. Becker spent the remainder of his career writing, lecturing, and warning anyone who would listen about what he had found and what had been done to stop him from finding more. The Body Electric and his follow-up, Cross Currents, became underground classics in alternative medicine communities, read by practitioners who recognized in his documented findings the scientific foundation for treatments that mainstream oncology refused to pursue. To this day, the electrotherapy protocols Becker developed for tumor suppression have never been formally evaluated in a controlled clinical trial by any major cancer research institution in the United States. He died in 2008. His laboratory equipment had long since been dispersed or destroyed. The research programs he had fought to build were never reinstated. The military installations he had warned about continued to expand. If Becker's electrotherapy system truly demonstrated that targeted electrical currents could cause cancer cells to revert to a non-malignant state, and if the same principle that regrew salamander limbs could be applied to halt human tumor growth, then what was dismantled in that Syracuse laboratory in 1980 was not a failed experiment. It was a working answer. And if that is what the Department of Defense understood it to be, then the closure of Robert Becker's lab was not a budget decision. It was a silencing, the Laetrile infusion device. In 1971, in a gleaming clinic in Tijuana, Mexico, just across the border from the country that had banned it, a treatment was being administered to American cancer patients who had driven, flown, and in some cases been carried across the international boundary to receive it. The treatment was Laetrile, a compound derived from apricot kernels, chemically related to vitamin B17, and it was being delivered through specialized intravenous infusion devices that allowed it to be introduced directly into the bloodstream at controlled concentrations. The patients coming to these clinics were not the desperate and the gullible. They were people who had exhausted every option their American oncologists had offered them, and who had found, through whisper networks and underground newsletters, that something was happening in Tijuana that their doctors refused to discuss. The theory behind Laetrile was not scientifically absurd. It proposed that amygdalin, the active compound in Laetrile, was selectively metabolized by cancer cells, which contain an enzyme called beta-glucosidase in far higher concentrations than healthy cells, releasing hydrogen cyanide specifically within the tumor environment while healthy tissue, protected by a neutralizing enzyme called rhodinase, remained unharmed. It was a targeted delivery mechanism, decades before targeted therapy became the celebrated frontier of modern oncology. Proponents pointed to clinical observations from physicians in Mexico, Germany, and the Philippines. Patients pointed to their own survival. The FDA pointed to a 1953 report by the California Cancer Commission that had declared Laetrile ineffective, a report that critics noted had never subjected the compound to a controlled clinical trial. By the mid-1970s, Laetrile had become the most popular alternative cancer treatment in the United States, used by an estimated 70,000 Americans annually. 27 states had passed legislation legalizing its use within their borders. Physicians who administered it reported outcomes they could not reconcile with the FDA's characterization of the compound as worthless. Then the federal government moved. The FDA classified Laetrile as an unapproved new drug, making its interstate transport a federal crime. Raids on clinics and distributors began. Specialized infusion equipment was seized and destroyed. Physicians who had been documenting patient outcomes found their licenses threatened and their offices visited by federal investigators. The most prominent American physician associated with Laetrile treatment was Dr. John Richardson of Albany, California, who had treated hundreds of cancer patients with the compound and kept meticulous records of their outcomes. He was arrested 3 times. Each time, patients crowded the courtroom to testify on his behalf. Each time, the legal proceedings drained his resources, consumed his time, and kept him from his clinic. He was eventually forced out of practice. His patient records were confiscated during raids and were never returned. No investigation was pursued into what those records contained or what happened to them afterward. The culmination of the FDA's campaign came in 1977, when the agency obtained a nationwide injunction effectively banning Laetrile from the United States entirely. The National Cancer Institute, facing enormous public pressure, finally agreed to conduct a retrospective review of Laetrile cases in 1978, examining records submitted by physicians who had used the treatment. The review found that of the cases examined, a number showed tumor regression or stabilization that could not be attributed to other treatments. The NCI quietly noted the findings and declined to proceed to a formal clinical trial. To this day, no properly controlled Phase 3 clinical trial of Laetrile has ever been conducted in the United States. If the Laetrile infusion device truly delivered a compound capable of selectively destroying cancer cells through their own enzymatic chemistry, if the 70,000 Americans using it annually were experiencing genuine remissions that federal agents destroyed the evidence of, then what happened in those raids was not consumer protection. It was the systematic elimination of a treatment that threatened an industry generating billions of dollars annually from the drugs that replaced it. And if that is what the FDA understood when it moved against Laetrile, then the injunction of 1977 was not a medical decision. It was a financial one. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. In our next episode, we'll cover even more shocking cases of suppressed medicine that the pharmaceutical industry has buried for decades. Turn on the bell icon so you get notified the moment it goes live. This journey is just beginning, and the deeper we go, the clearer the pattern becomes. Hulda Clark's Zapper. In 1988, in a modest research office in Indianapolis, Indiana, a woman with a PhD in physiology from the University of Minnesota sat down and began documenting something that would make her the most ridiculed and most relentlessly prosecuted alternative health researcher in North American history. Her name was Hulda Reger Clark, and what she had found, or believed she had found, was that every case of cancer she had examined shared a single common factor. Not genetics, not environmental toxins in isolation, not random cellular mutation, parasite, specifically, a flatworm called Fasciolopsis buskii, which Clark claimed completed part of its life cycle in human tissue when the body was simultaneously exposed to a solvent called isopropyl alcohol. Remove the parasite and the solvent, she argued, and the cancer stopped. The device she built to accomplish this was deceptively simple. Clark's Zapper was a small, handheld electrical device that generated a low-frequency square wave current, approximately 30 kHz, delivered to the body through copper electrodes held in the palms. The theory was that this frequency, applied for a specific duration, was lethal to parasites, bacteria, and viruses residing in human tissue while remaining completely harmless to the human cells surrounding them. It was, in principle, a direct application of the same resonant frequency logic that Royal Rife had pursued 60 years earlier, the idea that every organism has a frequency at which it cannot survive. Clark had simply built a version that anyone could hold in their hands and operate at home. She published her findings in 1993 in a book titled The Cure for All Cancers, which laid out her entire protocol, the zapper frequencies, the herbal parasite cleanse, the dietary eliminations, in enough detail that anyone with basic electronics knowledge could build the device themselves. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Testimonials flooded in from patients who reported tumor regression, restored energy, and clean follow-up scans that their physicians could not explain. Clark herself treated patients at a clinic in Tijuana, the same border city that had sheltered Laetrile practitioners before her, and kept detailed records of their outcomes. The medical establishment did not engage with her data. It engaged with her personally. The FDA and the FTC launched coordinated investigations into Clark's operations. Her clinic in Indiana was raided in 1999. Equipment was seized. Her books were targeted for removal from distribution through cease and desist actions directed at publishers and retailers. She was pursued across the border into Mexico, where regulatory pressure from American agencies followed her even there, creating legal complications for the Tijuana clinic that disrupted her ability to treat patients. Colleagues who distributed her zapper devices were prosecuted for selling unlicensed medical equipment. The campaign against her was not brief. It spanned more than a decade and followed her until the end of her life. What made Clark's case particularly striking was the breadth of her documentation. She was not issuing anecdotal reports from memory. She had published detailed case files, before and after diagnostic records, and reproducible protocols that she invited anyone to test independently. Critics argued her science was fundamentally flawed, that her parasite theory was unproven and her frequency claims lacked peer-reviewed validation. But no institution ever conducted an independent trial of her zapper using her own specified protocols. To this day, not one controlled study has been published testing the Clark zapper under the conditions she prescribed. The criticism was loud. The investigation was never done. Hulda Clark died in September 2009 at the age of 80, in a care facility in California. The official cause of death was complications from a spinal cord injury. She had spent the final 2 decades of her life being prosecuted, ridiculed, and chased across 2 countries, while the patients who had used her protocol continued to share their outcomes in forums and communities that the medical establishment declined to examine. If Clark's zapper truly generated frequencies capable of eliminating the parasitic and microbial conditions she identified as the root cause of cancer, and if the thousands of documented patient outcomes she recorded represent genuine, reproducible remissions, then what was seized in those raids was not dangerous pseudoscience. It was a body of evidence. And if that is what the FDA understood it to be, then the decade-long campaign against Hulda Clark was not about protecting the public. It was about protecting something else entirely. Antoine Priory's plasma radiation machine. In 1960, in a cluttered workshop in Bordeaux, France, a self-taught Italian-born technician named Antoine Priory switched on a machine that no one, including Priory himself, could fully explain. It stood nearly 12 feet tall, consumed enormous quantities of electrical power, and generated a rotating magnetic field threaded with plasma radiation, pulsed electromagnetic frequencies, and a combination of energies that defied straightforward classification under any existing scientific framework. What it allegedly did was this: it cured cancer. Not in isolated cell cultures. Not in anecdotal patient reports from a border clinic. In rigorously controlled laboratory experiments conducted by credentialed French scientists on animals with transplanted tumors, under conditions that should have satisfied every demand of the scientific method. The tumors disappeared. Every time. The scientific figures who investigated Priory's machine were not marginal figures operating outside mainstream academia. Professor Raymond Poitrazzel of the University of Bordeaux was one of France's most respected immunologists, and he spent years conducting controlled animal trials using Priory's device. The results Poitrazzel documented were unambiguous. Mice and rats with advanced, Transplanted cancers that were universally fatal in control groups showed complete tumor regression after treatment with the machine's emissions. The immune systems of treated animals were measurably reactivated in ways that conventional immunology struggled to account for. Poitrazzel published his findings in peer-reviewed French scientific journals. The response from the international scientific community was not engagement. It was silence. The French government did not ignore priori entirely, which makes what happened next even more difficult to explain away. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, the French military and several government science agencies provided Priori with funding to continue his research and build increasingly powerful versions of his machine. Millions of francs were allocated. A formal research program was established. Scientists from multiple French universities were assigned to study the device and understand its mechanism. Then, in the mid-1970s, the funding stopped. Abruptly. Completely. No official explanation was provided. The research program was dissolved. The scientists were reassigned. Priori was left alone with a machine that nobody would officially acknowledge anymore. What followed was a slow institutional strangulation. Without government funding, Priori could not maintain or develop his equipment. The machine that had produced consistent, documented, reproducible tumor elimination in controlled laboratory animals fell into disrepair. Priori spent years petitioning the French scientific establishment for renewed support, submitting documentation, requesting formal evaluations, and receiving nothing in return but bureaucratic delay and institutional indifference. Colleagues who had witnessed the animal trial results and continued to advocate publicly for renewed investigation found their professional reputations quietly undermined. The research that had been conducted, peer-reviewed, published, reproducible, was simply never followed up. Antoine Priori died in 1983, his machine silent, his research unfinished, and the mechanism behind his device's effects unexplained to this day. A small number of physicists and bioelectromagnetics researchers continued to study what little documentation survived, publishing papers in the 1990s and 2000s that argued the Priori machine's effects were theoretically consistent with known principles of electromagnetic interaction with biological tissue. Those papers were published in minor journals and attracted no institutional funding. To this day, no major cancer research body, not the National Cancer Institute, not the World Health Organization, not any European equivalent, has ever formally reviewed the peer-reviewed animal trial data that Professor Poitrazzel spent years producing. The French government funded Antoine Priori's work long enough to confirm that something extraordinary was happening inside that Bordeaux workshop. Then it walked away. No explanation was ever given for why millions of francs of public money were invested in a cancer treatment program that was then abandoned at the precise moment it was producing its most compelling results. If Priori's plasma radiation machine truly eliminated tumors by reactivating the immune system through rotating electromagnetic fields, and if the controlled animal trials that credentialed French scientists conducted and published represent genuine, reproducible cancer elimination, then what was abandoned in that Bordeaux workshop was not a failed experiment. It was a completed one. And if that is what the French government understood when it cut the funding and walked away, then the silence that followed was not scientific uncertainty. It was a decision, a deliberate, calculated, devastating decision. These inventions, scattered across decades and continents, do not form a random collection of curiosities. From Royal Rife's frequency instrument in 1934 San Diego to Antoine Priori's plasma machine in 1960s Bordeaux, each case follows a chilling model, a working device, documented results, institutional interest, and then erasure. The suppression was not accidental. It was methodical. The inventors were not hoaxes. The patients were not imagining their recoveries. The physicians who witnessed the results were not fools. What these cases collectively describe is a system, an eraser, that activates whenever a technology threatens to make the treatment of cancer unnecessary. Each case points to a methodical resistance built into the very institutions we trust to protect us. From Rife's raided laboratory to Priori's abandoned workshop, the pattern of control is identical. Fund it long enough to understand it, then bury it before it reaches the public. The AMA, the FDA, the NCI, and government science agencies on 2 continents all played their role. The names changed. The decades changed. The outcome never did. The destruction was never loud. It came in silence. Seized patents and confiscated equipment, revoked funding and threatened licenses, fires that consumed decades of research, laboratories emptied overnight without explanation. What was lost in that silence was not just technology. It was a future where cancer was treated with frequency rather than chemotherapy, a future where the immune system was reactivated rather than poisoned, a future where a device costing hundreds of dollars replaced a treatment costing hundreds of thousands, a future where the diagnosis was not a financial transaction. These were not simply ideas. They were turning points, and someone somewhere chose to turn away. The erasure continues. Whistleblowers disappear into legal proceedings that drain their resources and silence their findings. Patents for electromagnetic and frequency-based cancer treatments are filed, approved, and quietly buried in portfolios that never move to clinical development. Researchers who publish outside the approved framework find their funding cut and their careers redirected. The mechanism is cleaner now than it was in Rife's era. No book burnings, no dramatic laboratory raids. Just paperwork and silence, and the steady pressure of institutions that have more to lose from a cure than from a continuing crisis. Every year, millions of people receive a cancer diagnosis and are offered the same three options that have defined oncology for 70 years: surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, while the alternatives that credentialed scientists documented and published across the 20th century remain officially uninvestigated. That is not a failure of science. That is a policy. The tragedy is not that these technologies failed. The tragedy is that they worked, and that was the problem. You have just watched 10 documented cases of medical technology that was developed, tested, witnessed, and then systematically destroyed. You have seen the pattern. Not once, not twice, but 10 times across 10 different inventors, 10 different countries, 10 different decades. That pattern is not coincidence. It is policy. And now that you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. Awareness is the first step toward accountability, and accountability begins with people who refuse to look away. If this video was eye-opening for you, please subscribe to the channel. New investigations go live every week, and every one of them covers ground that mainstream media will not touch. Turn on the bell notification so that you never miss an episode, because some of our most important videos reach people only in the first hours before the algorithm buries them. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. A friend, a family member, anyone who has been touched by cancer and deserves to know that other paths may have existed. Drop your thoughts and theories in the comments below, because this community's collective knowledge is part of what keeps this research alive. All sources referenced in this video are available in the description. Read them, verify them, and then ask yourself why none of this was ever on the news.